Hello, my name is Valeria. This is my new original story on my channel. Subscribe and enjoy.
Nobody knew. The curvy baker was hiding a crown prince until he returned to claim his throne. For her, the throne room of Eldenhall Palace had never held so many witnesses at once, and Annie Whitfield had certainly never expected to be one of them, standing in a borrowed gown beneath a ceiling painted 3 centuries earlier, while 200 members of the Eldorian nobility waited to see whether the man beside her would be crowned king or arrested as an impostor before sunset. Somewhere near the front of the gathered council, Lord Chancellor Edric Thorne adjusted his sleeve with the same unhurried calm he had worn for 11 years of quietly running a kingdom from the shadows of other men's titles. Alexander stood at the center of the room, his jaw tight, watching the woman beside him, as though the next few minutes would decide considerably more than his own future. Nobody in that room understood how a baker from a narrow street in Manhattan had ended up standing at the center of a coronation crisis for a country she had never heard of 3 months earlier. To understand that, we have to go back. Not weeks. We have to go back to a cold morning in early autumn, long before any of this began. Annie Whitfield had inherited Whitfield's bakery from her aunt 3 years earlier, along with a stack of unpaid utility bills, a roof that complained loudly every time it rained, and a small but devoted circle of regulars who came less for the cinnamon rolls than for the particular comfort of being remembered by name. She was 27, with soft, rounded curves she had long since stopped apologizing for, and strong, capable hands that knew exactly how much pressure a loaf of sourdough could withstand before it collapsed in on itself. She opened the bakery at 5 each morning, alone, because she could not yet afford to hire help, and closed it again at 7 each evening, exhausted in the particular way that came from doing physical work she genuinely loved, while constantly calculating whether this month's flour order would leave enough left over for rent. Her one regular help came from Marie Okafor, a part-time college student who worked the afternoon counter shift 3 days a week, and had quietly become something closer to family than employee over the past year. Marie knew, without ever being told directly, exactly which regulars needed an extra minute of conversation, along with their coffee, and exactly when Annie needed someone else to handle the register so she could disappear into the back and breathe for 5 minutes between the morning rush and the lunch crowd. "You are going to work yourself into the ground one of these days," Marie told her at least once a week, usually while watching Annie restock flour bins, well past the point her shift technically ended. Annie usually laughed it off, because the alternative to working herself into the ground had been losing the bakery entirely 2 years earlier, back when her aunt's debts first came due, and exhaustion had always seemed the considerably more survivable option. The morning everything changed began like every other morning, except for the man bleeding quietly in the alley behind her shop. She found him while hauling in sacks of flour before sunrise, slumped against the brick wall, in a torn, expensive-looking coat, a gash above his temple dried into a dark crust against pale skin. Most people, Annie would later admit, might have called for an ambulance and kept their distance. She had grown up in a family that believed wounded strangers deserved help before they deserved questions, and so she dragged him inside, propped him on a stool by the prep counter, and cleaned the wound with the same brisk efficiency she used to handle every other crisis the bakery threw at her. He woke with a sharp inhale and the particular stillness of someone braced for an attack rather than assistance. "Where am I?" he asked, his accent faint, but unmistakably foreign, carefully smoothed over by years of practice, but not quite gone. "In a bakery on the corner of 9th and Lex," Annie said, not looking up from the wound. "Who you are, and why someone decided to rearrange your face in my alley, is a separate question I would still like answered." He introduced himself as Alex Mercer, a business school student, and offered a vague, poorly stitched story about a mugging gone wrong. Annie did not believe a single word of it. His posture was too straight, his speech too deliberate, his cufflinks, torn jacket and all, too expensive for a man supposedly robbed for spare cash. She did not push. People who arrived at her back door before dawn, she had learned, usually carried stories they were not yet ready to tell a stranger. "You will stay here until the room stops spinning," she said, handing him a cup of strong coffee. "After that, it is entirely your business who you tell what to." He stayed nearly 2 hours, watching in near total silence as she shaped cinnamon rolls with the kind of practiced, almost meditative precision that came from doing the same motion 10,000 times. He asked a handful of careful questions about the bakery, about her aunt, about the neighborhood, and offered almost nothing about himself in return. Before he left, he set a bill on the counter large enough to cover a month of rent, and disappeared as suddenly as he had arrived. Annie was certain she would never see him again. If you are already curious about who Alex really is, and why someone wanted him hurt badly enough to leave him bleeding in an alley, this is a good moment to subscribe, because the answer arrives faster than you might expect, and it changes the shape of this entire story. He returned 3 days later, this time through the front door, in a flawlessly tailored suit, without a single visible mark from the injury that had bled freely onto her counter days earlier. He bought a croissant, sat at the small table by the window, and stayed until closing, reading a newspaper Annie noticed he never once turned a page of. That became the pattern for the following 3 weeks. Alex Mercer appeared at the bakery almost every evening near closing, helped her stack chairs, though she repeatedly insisted he did not need to, occasionally washed dishes despite her protests, and slowly revealed about himself only exactly as much as a deeply careful man permits himself to reveal. Annie was not naive. She noticed the black sedan with tinted windows that idled outside the bakery one afternoon, and pulled away the moment Alex spotted it through the window. She noticed the particular tension that crossed his face whenever an unfamiliar number called his phone. Tension he carefully smoothed away before answering in flawless, rehearsed English. She noticed the scar on his shoulder, which, on closer inspection one evening, while helping him out of a soaked coat during a sudden downpour, looked far too deliberate to belong to a random street mugging. That particular evening, the rain had arrived without warning, trapping Alex inside the bakery long past his usual departure time, while the storm hammered the windows and turned the street outside into a sheet of reflected neon. Annie made tea instead of coffee, an unspoken acknowledgement that he was staying a while longer than usual, and they sat together at the small table by the window, watching the rain instead of speaking for several long, comfortable minutes. "My mother used to say storms were the only honest weather," Alex said eventually, his voice quieter than she had heard it before. "Everything else pretends to be something it might not stay. A storm tells you exactly what it is the moment it arrives." That sounds like the kind of thing someone says when they are used to people pretending around them, Annie said, watching him rather than the window. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "It is," he finally said, "though I have noticed you do not pretend much about anything. It is somewhat disorienting, in the best possible way." She did not press him further that night, though something in the way he watched the rain, instead of meeting her eyes, told her the scar on his shoulder belonged to a story considerably larger and considerably more dangerous than anything he had yet been willing to share. "Who are you, really, Alex?" she finally asked one evening, the two of them alone in the bakery, stacking the last of the chairs. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkened street. A man who has spent the last 18 months living under a name that is not his own, because his real name is too dangerous to carry openly, he said finally. A man whose parents died in a plane crash that, as it turned out a year after their funeral, was not actually an accident. A man who was supposed to die that same night, except his security detail managed to get him out of the country 12 hours before the attack that killed them. Annie froze with a chair still raised halfway off the floor. "What country?" "Eldoria," he said, speaking the word aloud for what was clearly the first time in 18 months. "A small kingdom in Europe you have likely never heard of, because my family has spent the last 2 centuries carefully avoiding the kind of attention larger monarchies attract. I am the last living heir to the throne, and for the past 18 months, my own uncle, who currently rules the country as regent, has done everything in his power to keep it that way." Annie did not find words right away. The phrase "crown prince" sounded so entirely out of place in a bakery smelling of cinnamon and slightly burnt morning bread that she nearly laughed until she registered the complete seriousness on his face. "Why are you telling me this now?" she finally asked. "Because yesterday, the same black sedan you noticed outside 3 weeks ago parked outside your building instead of mine," Alex said, and for the first time since she had known him, real fear crossed his face. Fear that was not for himself. Which means someone has connected the two of us. Which means you are in danger now, simply because you happened to drag a wounded stranger into your bakery instead of stepping over him. Before Annie could answer, the bell above the front door chimed, though she was certain she had locked it after closing. 2 men in dark coats stood in the doorway, and the one in front stopped, studying Alex with the expression of a man who had finally found what he had spent 18 months searching for. "Your Highness," he said in a language Annie did not understand, though she recognized the tone instantly, and it was not threat. It was something closer to relief. "We have finally located you, and we have very little time, because your uncle the regent died 3 days ago, and the council has called for the succession to be settled within the fortnight. If you have ever wondered what it would feel like to discover the quiet stranger you fell for is actually a king waiting to be crowned, stay with us, because what happens next moves quickly, and you do not want to miss a single piece of it." The man at the door introduced himself as Captain Daniel Boyd, head of what remained of Alexander's loyal personal security, a small handful of men who had spent 18 months protecting a prince the rest of the world believed had vanished entirely. He explained, in careful, urgent fragments, what had happened. 3 nights earlier, Regent Frederick had collapsed during a council dinner and died within hours, officially of a sudden heart failure, though Boyd's tone made clear he did not entirely believe that explanation either. Eldorian succession law, ancient and stubbornly specific, allowed exactly 14 days from the regent's death for the rightful heir to present himself before the royal council and claim the crown. If no heir appeared within that window, the regency would pass permanently to the next eligible branch of the family, which happened to be Frederick's own bloodline, represented by his ambitious young nephew, a man named Edmund Calloway, who had spent the past 18 months conveniently positioning himself as Frederick's successor. You have 11 days remaining to return to Eldoria, present yourself before the council, and be crowned, Boyd said. 11 days to undo 18 months of hiding, and we cannot guarantee your safety, even once we get you there, because whoever orchestrated your parents' death is very likely still active inside that palace. Alexander's hand found Annie's without either of them seeming to notice they had reached for each other. I am not leaving her here, he said. If they connected the two of us once, they will do it again the moment I am gone, and I will not let her pay for my survival. Boyd studied Annie for a long, assessing moment, the particular look of a man recalculating a careful plan to account for an unexpected variable. Then she comes with us, he said finally, though I should warn you both, Miss Whitfield, that the Eldorian royal court is considerably less forgiving of unexpected variables than a Manhattan bakery. Annie closed the shop that night without fully understanding what she was agreeing to, leaving a handwritten note taped to the door, explaining only that a family emergency had called her away, and that her assistant Marie would be covering the next several mornings, using the spare keys hidden beneath the loose brick by the back step. She packed a single suitcase, mostly out of habit, since nothing in her closet remotely resembled what one wore inside a European palace, and within 6 hours found herself on a private plane crossing the Atlantic beside a man she had known for exactly 3 weeks, who happened to be the uncrowned king of a country she could not yet locate confidently on a map. Somewhere over open ocean, with Boyd asleep in the seat across the aisle, and the cabin lights dimmed for the long overnight stretch, Alexander finally allowed the composed mask he had worn since the moment Boyd walked through her bakery door to slip, if only briefly. I left this country 18 months ago in the trunk of a delivery van, hidden under crates of vegetables, certain I would never set foot in it again, he said quietly, watching the dark ocean below through the small window. I told myself that was a kind of freedom, not having a crown waiting for me anymore. I am not entirely certain I believed it, but it was easier than grieving for a life that no longer existed. And now? Annie asked. Now, I am flying back toward exactly the life I told myself I no longer wanted, beside someone who has every reason to wonder whether I dragged her into the most dangerous decision of her life, simply because I was too selfish to face it alone, he said. You did not drag me anywhere, Annie said. I dragged you into my bakery first, if anyone is keeping score. Whatever happens once we land, that part was already my choice. He looked at her then, something unguarded crossing his face that she had not seen in 3 weeks, of careful, measured conversations, over closing chairs, and unwashed dishes. And for a moment, neither of them said anything else at all. It was into that fragile quiet that Boyd's phone buzzed with the encrypted message that would change the shape of everything ahead of them. Boyd was already awake by the time the message finished decrypting, his expression sharpening as he read it twice, as though hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something less alarming. The regent had not simply died of natural causes. A discreet private autopsy, arranged before the official Eldorian physician could close the case, found trace amounts of a slow-acting compound in his system, consistent with poisoning administered gradually over several weeks rather than a single dose. "Someone has been killing the Regent for weeks," Boyd said grimly, setting the phone down. "Which means whoever murdered your parents 18 months ago did not simply vanish after Frederick took power. They have been inside that palace the entire time, patient enough to wait, and ruthless enough to remove Frederick the moment he was no longer useful to them. Frederick ordered my parents killed," Alexander said slowly, working through the implications as he spoke. Everyone in the family believed that, even if no one could prove it. If someone has now killed Frederick as well, that means Frederick was never the true architect of any of this. He was simply the face of it. Annie, listening from the seat beside him, with the particular clarity of someone entirely outside the situation, and therefore able to see its edges more clearly than those tangled inside it, found herself asking the question that would eventually matter more than either man yet realized. Who benefits most from Frederick dying now, exactly 11 days before the succession deadline? She asked. Because whoever that is, Alex, that is very likely the same person who benefited from your parents dying 18 months ago. Both men turned to look at her in the dim cabin light, the question settling into the silence with the particular weight of something obviously true that nobody else had yet thought to say aloud. They landed in Eldoria under cover of darkness, smuggled into a private wing of Eldenhall Palace through a service entrance Boyd insisted only 4 living people knew existed. Annie's first sight of the palace, glimpsed briefly through the car window during the final approach, was a sprawling structure of pale stone and steep slate roofs, lit by floodlights against the night sky, considerably larger and considerably more intimidating than anything her small Manhattan bakery had prepared her to absorb. Waiting for them in a private sitting room, dressed in morning black despite the late hour, was Dowager Queen Helena, Alexander's grandmother, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s whose grief over her son's death 18 months earlier had clearly hardened into something closer to vigilance than sorrow. "You look exactly like your father at this age," she said to Alexander, studying him with an intensity that made Annie understand immediately where the rest of the family's composure under pressure had originated. Then her gaze shifted to Annie, taking in the unfamiliar curves, the simple traveling clothes, the obvious exhaustion of someone who had boarded a private plane 4 hours earlier, still wearing a flour-dusted apron beneath her coat. "And you must be the reason my grandson finally agreed to come home. I am the reason he had somewhere safe to recover when he showed up bleeding in my alley," Annie said carefully, unsure of the correct way to address a dowager queen, and deciding honesty was safer than guessing at protocol. "Whatever happens next between us, that part is simply true." Something in Helena's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "Good," she said. "This family has had quite enough of people who tell us only what we want to hear." For the next several days, Eldenhall Palace became a strange blend of mourning and quiet preparation, the entire court draped in black for Frederick's funeral, while simultaneously bracing for the coronation that would follow it within days. Alexander spent long hours in closed meetings with the royal council, relearning the rhythms of a world he had been forcibly removed from 18 months earlier, while Annie found herself largely left to her own devices in a palace built to make outsiders feel exactly as small as it intended. He found a half hour for her each evening regardless, usually after the household had quieted, walking her through the particular landmines of Eldorian court etiquette, with the patient amusement of someone relieved to have a single subject in his day that had nothing to do with regents or forged ledgers. You never address a dowager queen directly unless she speaks to you first, he explained one evening, the two of them sitting on the floor of his study, in a deliberate echo of their evenings in the bakery, since neither of them had quite adjusted to using furniture clearly designed for people more dignified than either felt at the moment. You bow from the neck, not the waist, unless it is a formal court occasion, in which case the waist is expected, and you never, under any circumstances, turn your back on the throne while it is occupied. I run a bakery, Annie said. The most complicated etiquette I have ever needed involved deciding whether to comp a regular's coffee on their birthday. You are doing remarkably well, considering, he said, and the warmth in his voice made the comment land less like reassurance and more like something closer to admiration. Says the man who once told me his cover story involved a mugging while wearing cufflinks worth more than my monthly rent, Annie said, and his laugh, genuine and unguarded in a way she had rarely heard from him since the night he confessed who he really was, stayed with her long after the lesson ended. She did not retreat into the role of decorative house guest, waiting quietly in borrowed rooms. Within 2 days, restless and unaccustomed to idleness, she found her way into the palace kitchens, where the elderly head baker, a stooped man named Henrik, who had served 3 generations of the royal family, watched with open suspicion as the American woman traveling with the prince rolled up her sleeves and began correcting the proofing temperature on a batch of bread that had been rising incorrectly, by her estimation, for as long as he had been making it. "You bake," Henrik said, somewhere between accusation and grudging respect, after tasting the results. "I bake," Annie confirmed. "It is the only language I am fluent in that nobody here seems to find confusing." She spent her mornings in the kitchens after that, partly to keep her hands busy and her mind quiet, and partly because Henrik, once his initial suspicion faded, turned out to know more palace gossip than any council member would have admitted aloud. Not everyone inside Eldenhall Palace extended her the same grudging respect. On her 3rd day, crossing the formal garden on her way back from the kitchens, Annie was intercepted by Lady Caroline Ashford, a distant cousin of the royal family, whose perfectly arranged smile did nothing to soften the deliberate cruelty underneath it. "You must be the American the prince brought home with him," Caroline said, her gaze moving over Annie's flour-dusted apron with theatrical surprise. How resourceful of him, finding someone so comfortable in a kitchen. I am sure the staff appreciate having someone who understands their world so naturally. "I do understand kitchens," Annie said evenly, refusing to give Caroline the reaction she was clearly fishing for. "I have spent 3 years running one entirely on my own, which is considerably more than most people in this garden can say about anything they currently hold a title for." Caroline's smile flattened slightly, though she recovered quickly. "How charming that you are not embarrassed by it. Most women in your position would be." "I am not in a position that requires embarrassment," Annie said, stepping past her toward the palace doors. "Though I imagine that must be a difficult concept for someone whose entire position depends on other people's opinions of her family name." She did not look back to see Caroline's reaction, though Henrik, who had apparently watched the entire exchange from a kitchen window, greeted her return with the closest thing to outright approval she had seen from him yet. It was in the kitchens, on her 4th morning in Eldoria, that Annie first heard Lord Chancellor Edric Thorne's name, spoken with anything other than total reverence. A careful man, Henrik said, kneading dough with hands gnarled from 60 years of the same motion. Too careful, some say. He has run this kingdom's finances and foreign affairs for 11 years, through 2 regents and a king who trusted him completely. Strange, is it not, that a man so careful never once made a mistake large enough for anyone to notice, in 11 years of running a country through 2 sudden deaths? Something in that observation lodged in Annie's mind, the way a stray ingredient lodges in a recipe that otherwise looks correct, technically present, but somehow throwing off the entire balance. If the idea of a quiet kingdom hiding 11 years of careful, undetected manipulation has you leaning forward right now, that feeling is exactly why you should subscribe before continuing, because the next part of this story uncovers exactly how deep that manipulation goes. That evening, restless and unable to sleep in the unfamiliar quiet of the palace's eastern wing, Annie wandered down to the small library adjoining Alexander's private quarters, where she found him still awake, reading through a stack of his late mother's correspondence that Helena had finally allowed him access to that afternoon. She kept everything, he said, without looking up, gesturing at the stack of letters and ledgers spread across the desk. Every council meeting note, every financial report she ever reviewed as queen consort. My mother distrusted exactly one person in this entire palace enough to keep her own private copies of his work. And reading these now, I am beginning to understand why. Annie sat across from him and picked up one of the ledgers, a habit she could not entirely set aside, even inside a foreign palace. The handwriting was meticulous, the figures organized with obsessive precision, and within 20 minutes of cross-referencing entries, with idle curiosity, rather than any real expertise, she found the first discrepancy. "Alex," she said slowly, turning the ledger toward him, "this entry from 18 months ago, dated 3 days before your parents' plane crash, shows an unusually large transfer of palace security funding, redirected to what is labeled here only as special logistics. The signature authorizing it is your Uncle Frederick's. But look at the ink." Alexander leaned closer, studying the page. "It is a different shade than the surrounding entries," he said slowly. "Slightly darker, slightly newer. Running a bakery on a thin margin for 3 years teaches you to notice when numbers do not match the story they are supposed to tell," Annie said. "Someone added this entry after the fact and forged your uncle's signature to make it look like he authorized whatever special logistics paid for 3 days before your parents' plane went down. Frederick could not have forged his own signature into a fake entry," Alexander said, the pieces visibly assembling themselves behind his eyes. "Someone else did this, and let everyone believe Frederick was responsible for our parents' deaths, while the real architect remained completely above suspicion for 18 months. Someone with access to palace financial records, old enough to insert a convincing forgery," Annie said. "Someone careful enough that in 11 years of running this kingdom's finances, nobody thought to question a single entry. Neither of them said the name aloud yet, though both were already thinking it. The following days moved quickly and dangerously. Alexander, advised by Helena and Boyd to proceed carefully, rather than accuse the kingdom's most powerful, unelected official without irrefutable proof, continued his public preparations for the coronation, while quietly building a case alongside Annie during the narrow hours when the rest of the palace slept. They cross-referenced 18 months of financial records against Thorne's documented movements, building a timeline that grew more damning with each late-night session, even as the coronation deadline counted down with merciless precision. One night, deep in the financial records archive long after the rest of the palace had gone dark, Annie and Alexander came within a single closed door of being discovered entirely. They had let themselves in using a key Boyd had quietly obtained from a guard, loyal to Helena, working by the narrow beam of a single shielded flashlight, rather than risk the overhead lights drawing attention from the corridor outside. Footsteps echoed faintly down the hall, slow and deliberate, pausing for a long moment directly outside the archive door, before continuing on toward the eastern wing. "Thorne," Alexander breathed, once the footsteps had fully faded, his hand still pressed flat against the lamp switch he had killed the instant they heard the first sound. "He rarely walks this corridor after midnight. If he had opened that door—" "He did not," Annie said, though her own heart was pounding loudly enough that she half expected it to be audible through the heavy wooden door. "Which means we have exactly as much time as it takes him to find a reason to come back. We should move faster." They did not stop that night, though they became considerably more careful afterward, timing their sessions for the narrow windows, when Boyd's loyal contacts confirmed Thorne had retired fully to his own private wing of the palace. Thorne, for his part, showed no outward sign of suspecting anything during daylight hours. He greeted Annie with the same polished, faintly condescending courtesy he extended to all of Alexander's American associations, treating her presence in the palace as an amusing inconvenience rather than a genuine threat. That confidence, Annie would later realize, was almost his greatest weapon. The particular invisibility that came from 11 years of nobody thinking to question him. That confidence did not stop him from acting. 6 days before the coronation, Boyd intercepted a palace footman attempting to deliver an evening drink to Alexander's private quarters that had not come from the kitchen staff Boyd personally vetted each morning. A hurried analysis by a security contact outside the palace confirmed trace amounts of the same slow-acting compound found in Frederick's autopsy, diluted carefully enough to mimic ordinary illness rather than sudden death. Whoever is behind this learned patience from watching it work the first time, Boyd said grimly, briefing Alexander and Annie in the same small library where they had spent so many late nights over the ledgers. Slow enough that nobody questions a king who simply grows weaker over several months. We increase security on anything entering these rooms, starting immediately. And Your Highness, you eat nothing that has not passed through hands I trust personally between now and the coronation. Annie found herself, without entirely deciding to, tasting Alexander's tea each morning before he did, a small, almost absurd gesture that he initially protested, and then, after the second week, simply accepted with the particular gratitude of a man no longer accustomed to anyone choosing to stand between him and danger without being asked. It very nearly worked entirely in his favor. 4 days before the coronation, Thorne requested a private audience with Annie, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for her continued stay following the ceremony. He received her in his private study, a room lined with leather-bound ledgers and framed certificates, documenting 11 years of unimpeachable service to the crown. "You have made quite an impression on the kitchen staff," he said, settling behind his desk with the particular smoothness of a man who had spent decades perfecting exactly this kind of conversation. "Henrik, in particular, seems quite taken with you. He talks rather more than is wise for a man in his position." Annie kept her expression carefully neutral. "He has been kind to me. I imagine that is not against palace policy." "Of course not," Thorne said, smiling without warmth. "Though I would gently suggest, Miss Whitfield, that a young woman in your position, far from home, unfamiliar with the considerably sharper edges of court politics, might find it wiser to focus on the bakery she will presumably be free to return to once the coronation concludes, rather than developing curious habits regarding palace financial records that are, strictly speaking, none of her concern." The threat arrived wrapped in courtesy so smooth that, had Annie been less certain of what she had found in those ledgers, she might have mistaken it for genuine concern. "I appreciate the advice," she said, holding his gaze steadily. "Though I have found that running a small business for 3 years teaches a person to recognize exactly when someone is trying to discourage them from looking too closely at numbers that do not add up." Something flickered behind Thorne's composed expression, gone almost before it registered. But Annie had spent 3 years reading the faces of customers who owed money they were hoping she would not notice, and she recognized it instantly. Fear, carefully buried beneath decades of practiced control. She left his study with her pulse hammering and went directly to find Alexander, certain now beyond any reasonable doubt exactly whose name belonged at the center of everything that had happened to his family. That night, lying awake in the unfamiliar quiet of her palace bedroom, Annie thought about her aunt, who had built the bakery from nothing and taught her that the people most desperate to keep you from looking closely at something were almost always the ones with the most to hide inside it. She thought about Marie, holding down the bakery alone in Manhattan, and about how impossibly far away cinnamon rolls and proofing temperatures suddenly felt, measured against forged ledgers, and a man patient enough to wait 11 years for the right moment to remove every obstacle between himself and absolute control of a kingdom. She was not safe inside Eldenhall Palace, and she understood that clearly now. But she was no longer willing to stay quiet, simply because staying quiet was safer. Helena found her that same night, sitting alone in the palace's smaller private library, long after most of the household had retired, staring at the forged ledger entry without quite seeing it anymore. "My son used to sit in this exact chair when something troubled him too much to sleep," Helena said, settling into the seat across from her without waiting for an invitation. "I am told you had a difficult conversation with our Lord Chancellor this afternoon. He suggested I should focus on returning to my bakery rather than asking questions about palace finances," Annie said. "That is Edric's particular gift," Helena said, her voice carrying the dry, exhausted weight of someone who had spent 11 years almost trusting a man she now suspected of murdering her own son. Making a threat sound like generous advice. I should have recognized it years ago. I did not, because recognizing it would have meant admitting I had handed this kingdom's finances to a man I never once thought to question. "You could not have known," Annie said. "Perhaps not," Helena said, "but you noticed within days what the rest of us missed for 11 years, and I find myself wondering whether that is simply because you arrived without 11 years of comfortable assumptions clouding your judgment. She studied Annie for a long moment. Whatever happens tomorrow, you have already given this family something Frederick's death, and my son's death, never managed to provide. An actual answer, instead of 18 months of grieving a question nobody could solve. She rose to leave, pausing at the doorway. "Wear the green gown tomorrow," she added. "It was my daughter-in-law's favorite color. I think she would have liked watching you wear it into that throne room considerably more than she would have liked watching anyone else." The morning of the coronation arrived gray and overcast. The kind of weather Henrik insisted was traditional for important Eldorian ceremonies, though Annie suspected he simply enjoyed having something dramatic to say about the sky. She dressed in a borrowed gown Helena had insisted on providing, a deep green that, for the first time in longer than she could remember, made her feel less like someone apologizing for the space she occupied, and more like someone who belonged exactly where she stood. Alexander found her in the palace corridor, an hour before the ceremony, already dressed in formal court attire that made him look, Annie thought, both entirely unfamiliar and completely himself at once. "Once this begins, there is no quiet way to stop it," he said. "If we accuse Thorn in that throne room without proof solid enough to survive every challenge he will throw at it, we do not simply fail to expose him. We hand him every remaining advantage he needs to finish what he started 18 months ago. Then we do not give him room to challenge it," Annie said. "I spent half of last night cross-referencing the dates on those forged entries against the palace's own visitor logs from 18 months ago. Thorn signed into the financial records archive alone, after hours, exactly 2 days before the entry appears to have been altered. The guard on duty that night kept a written log. Alex, the old-fashioned kind nobody thought to digitize or destroy, because nobody imagined anyone would ever think to check it." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, something between disbelief and overwhelming gratitude crossing his face. "You found that in one night." "I had excellent motivation," Annie said. "Nobody threatens to send me back to a bakery without finishing what I started." The throne room filled steadily through the morning. 200 members of Eldorian nobility, foreign dignitaries, and palace staff gathering beneath the painted ceiling to witness the formal crowning of a king most had assumed dead or permanently exiled 18 months earlier. Thorn stood near the front of the assembled council, composed and unreadable as always, beside Edmund Calloway, Frederick's ambitious nephew, whose carefully arranged expression of respectful patience did not entirely disguise the disappointment of a man watching his own claim to the throne dissolve in real time. The ceremony began precisely as tradition dictated, the Archbishop of Lindenburg reciting the opening invocation, while Alexander knelt before the ancient throne, Helena standing witness at his side with the particular rigid composure of a woman who had buried a son and refused to bury a grandson as well. It was Alexander himself who broke from tradition, rising before the crown could be placed, and turning to address the assembled council directly, his voice carrying clearly through the vast stone chamber. "Before this kingdom crowns me," he said, "it deserves to know the truth about how my parents actually died, and who has spent 18 months allowing my uncle to carry the blame for a crime he did not orchestrate alone." A ripple of startled murmurs moved through the gathered nobility. Thorn's expression remained perfectly composed, though Annie, watching closely from her position near Helena, saw his hand tighten almost imperceptibly against the edge of his own ceremonial robe. Annie stepped forward at Alexander's signal, carrying a leather folder containing 18 months of carefully assembled evidence, and addressed the council in the plain, steady voice she had once used to explain to skeptical customers exactly why her bread cost slightly more than the grocery store down the block. Because quality, properly explained, generally won people over in the end. 18 months ago, 3 days before the late King and Queen's plane crashed under circumstances later proven not to be accidental, palace security funding was secretly redirected through an entry forged into the financial ledgers, she said, holding up the document for the council to see. The entry bears Regent Frederick's signature. It is a forgery, written in ink that does not match the surrounding pages, on a date the palace's own archive visitor log shows Lord Chancellor Thorne entered the records room alone, after hours, 2 full days before that entry was supposedly authorized. "This is an absurd accusation," Thorne said, his voice maintaining its usual polish, even as a thin edge of strain crept into it. "A foreign commoner, with no legal standing in this court, is attempting to rewrite 18 months of settled history based on speculation about ink color." "Not speculation," Alexander said, his voice cold and steady. "Forensic document analysis, completed yesterday by the royal archivist at my personal request, confirms the entry was added at least 14 months after the surrounding pages, using ink manufactured well after my parents' deaths, combined with the archive log placing you alone in that room at the precise moment such a forgery would need to be created. The only remaining question, Lord Chancellor, is whether you ordered my uncle's murder personally, or simply removed him once his usefulness as your scapegoat finally expired." What followed was not a single dramatic confession, but something slower and considerably more damning, as the royal archivist, summoned forward to confirm his findings before the full council, walked the assembled nobility through 18 months of carefully reconstructed timeline, each piece of evidence logical and increasingly impossible to dismiss. Edmund Calloway, perhaps sensing the rapid collapse of whatever arrangement had positioned him as Frederick's heir, stepped back from Thorne's side with visible haste, his earlier patience replaced by open alarm. "I knew nothing of this," he said quickly, to anyone who would listen. "Whatever my uncle did, whatever Thorne arranged, I had no part in it." Lady Caroline Ashford, seated among the gathered nobility near the front of the chamber, went visibly pale beside her own mother, suddenly recalculating, Annie suspected, exactly how confidently she wished she had spoken to the American baker 3 days earlier in the garden. Helena rose from her seat beside the throne, silencing the rising murmur of the council with nothing more than the particular stillness of a woman who had outlived 2 regents and buried a son and had no remaining patience for theater. "This council has spent 18 months mourning my son without ever truly asking who profited from his death," she said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the chamber. "I will not spend a single additional hour pretending that question has not finally been answered. Lord Chancellor Thorne, you will surrender yourself to the captain of the guard, or you will be removed by force in front of every witness in this room. Either way, this matter concludes today." Thorne said very little after that, his expression settling into the particular stillness of a man calculating exits that had quietly stopped existing the moment Annie raised that folder. As the guards approached, something in his composure finally broke entirely. "I served 3 kings of this family," he said, his voice rising for the first time in 11 years, of careful, measured control. "I built this kingdom's treaties, rescued its finances twice from collapse, and was rewarded each time with nothing more than another decade of being the man who arranges things for someone else's crown. Frederick was a fool who needed careful guidance, simply to remain regent for 18 months. I gave this country stability no king in 3 generations managed alone, and I would have given it considerably more had Alexander simply stayed gone the way everyone assumed he would. It was not a confession anyone in the chamber found persuasive as justification, least of all Annie, who understood, from years of watching certain customers convince themselves their debts were someone else's fault, exactly how easily resentment curdled into entitlement when nursed carefully enough for long enough. But it finally explained the missing piece neither she nor Alexander had fully understood until that moment. Thorn had not done this purely for power in the abstract. He had done it because 11 years of being indispensable without ever being acknowledged had hardened, slowly and patiently, into the conviction that he deserved the throne considerably more than the family whose name happened to sit upon it. When the captain of the palace guard moved to detain him, he did not resist, though his eyes, fixed on Annie across the vast throne room, carried a coldness that made her grateful for the distance still separating them. There was one final piece left to surface before the morning fully resolved itself. Pressed by a council member demanding to know how Thorn had managed 18 months of undetected manipulation while maintaining his position as the kingdom's most trusted official, Alexander revealed the detail Annie had uncovered only hours earlier, almost too late to include in the morning's proceedings. The royal physician who had certified Frederick's death as natural heart failure, a quiet man named Dr. Aldrich Penn, who had served the family for over a decade, had received an unusually large, undisclosed payment from an account ultimately traced back to Thorn, dated the same week Frederick's symptoms first began. Penn, present in the throne room as protocol required for the coronation, went visibly pale as every eye in the chamber turned toward him. He did not deny it. He simply lowered his head and allowed himself to be escorted out alongside Thorn. The quiet, unremarkable collapse of a career built on looking away at precisely the right moments for precisely the right price. If watching an 11-year conspiracy unravel in a single morning has you holding your breath right now, this is exactly the moment to subscribe, because what happens next, between a future king and the baker who refused to let his family's truth stay buried, is the part of this story you do not want to miss. The coronation resumed within the hour, the council unanimously agreeing that justice delayed by minutes mattered considerably less than justice finally delivered after 18 months of waiting. Alexander knelt once more before the ancient throne, and this time, as the crown settled onto his head and the archbishop's voice rang out through the chamber, pronouncing him King Alexander III of Eldoria, no shadow of unfinished business remained to dim the moment. That evening, once the formal portraits had finally been taken, and the last foreign dignitary had offered the last rehearsed congratulation, the new king found Annie standing near the edge of the celebration in the great hall, watching the assembled court dance beneath chandeliers that had not been fully lit in 18 months. "You are supposed to be at the center of this, not hiding by the windows," he said, offering his hand. "I have spent considerably more time learning which fork to use than learning how anyone dances at events like this, Annie admitted. Then it is fortunate, he said, that I have spent the last 18 months learning to do most things badly and without an audience. We can be terrible at this together. He was not, in fact, terrible at it, though Annie suspected he had simply chosen to slow his steps to match her own considerably less practiced ones, and for the length of one song, with 200 members of Eldorian nobility watching, and an entire kingdom's worth of relief finally settling over the room. Neither of them thought once about ledgers, forgeries, or anything at all, beyond the small, steady space between them. The weeks that followed moved considerably faster than Annie had time to fully absorb. Thorne and Dr. Penn both faced formal charges before the royal court, the resulting trial drawing international attention to a small kingdom that had spent 2 centuries successfully avoiding exactly that kind of scrutiny. Edmund Calloway, cleared of direct involvement, but stripped of any remaining claim to succession, quietly relocated to a distant province and was rarely spoken of again. Eldoria's new king made it one of his first official acts to establish an independent financial oversight council, answerable directly to the people rather than any single minister, a reform he often credited, much to the bemusement of the assembled press, to a baker who had once explained to him that any business, kingdom included, eventually rotted from the inside if nobody outside the inner circle was permitted to check the numbers. As for Annie herself, she returned briefly to Manhattan, mostly to formally hand the bakery's daily operations over to Marie, who had managed the place admirably during her absence, and was, as it turned out, more than ready to take on full ownership of a business Annie no longer needed in quite the same way she once had. She found Alexander waiting for her on the palace balcony the evening she returned to Eldoria for good. The city of Lindenburg spread out gold and glittering beneath a sky finally clear of the gray clouds that had hung over the coronation weeks earlier. "You do not have to stay because of anything between us," he said carefully, the particular caution of a man who had learned, the hard way, never to assume someone else's choices belonged to him. "Helena has already offered you an honorary position, overseeing the palace's culinary staff, entirely on your own merit, regardless of whatever this is that has been happening between the two of us." Annie allowed herself, for the first time since the chaos of the coronation, a genuine, unguarded smile. "And what exactly is happening between us, Your Majesty?" she asked. "I am hoping," he said, "that it is the beginning of something neither of us has to hide in an alley behind a bakery to talk about anymore. If this story made you believe, even for a moment, that the quiet stranger bleeding outside your back door might turn out to be carrying an entire kingdom's worth of secrets, then you already understand exactly why we make these videos, and exactly why subscribing means you will never miss the next one." 6 months later, Annie Whitfield stood in the newly renovated palace kitchens, now formally serving as head of culinary operations for the Eldorian royal household, a title Henrik liked to joke she had earned the moment she corrected his proofing temperatures, rather than the moment any official document made it formal. She still rose before dawn, most mornings out of pure habit, though now it was to oversee a staff of 12, rather than manage a single counter alone. Marie sent regular updates from Manhattan, the bakery thriving under her care, its regulars delighted to learn their favorite owner had, in their words, married a prince. a story considerably simplified from the truth, but close enough that Annie no longer bothered correcting it. Marie herself visited Eldoria that spring, standing in the palace kitchens with an expression of pure, unguarded disbelief, as Henrik walked her through a working day that produced more bread before 9 in the morning than their entire Manhattan shop managed in a week. "You traded our little oven for this," Marie said, gesturing at the vast kitchen around them, somewhere between accusation and awe. "I traded a bakery for a kingdom that needed someone willing to ask uncomfortable questions about its own books," Annie said. "The bread is simply a pleasant coincidence." Lady Caroline Ashford, somewhat humbled by the events of the coronation, made a point of greeting Annie with considerably more genuine warmth at court functions that followed, an adjustment Helena observed with quiet, satisfied amusement whenever the two women crossed paths. Eldoria itself settled gradually into a version of stability it had not known in nearly 2 years. Its new king popular, not despite his 18 months in hiding, but partly because of it, a monarch who understood, in a way few of his predecessors ever had, exactly what it meant to be underestimated by people who never imagined a baker's instincts could expose what 11 years of palace politics had failed to catch. Late one evening, almost a year to the day after she first found a wounded stranger bleeding in an alley behind her bakery, Annie stood on the same palace balcony where Alexander had once asked her to stay, watching the lights of Lindenberg spread out gold and glittering below. Henrik's bread cooled on the counter behind her, the same recipe she had once made for a frightened man who told her nothing but his name. And somewhere inside the palace, she knew exactly where to find him if she wanted to share the view instead of watching it alone. Annie Whitfield spent 27 years believing competence in a small kitchen would never matter to anyone beyond the customers who walked through her door each morning. It took one wounded stranger, one forged ledger entry, and one impossible decision to step forward in a throne room full of strangers to prove that the person nobody expects to matter is often exactly the one paying close enough attention to save everything that does. If you stayed with this story until the very end, you already know it was worth it. And the only thing left to do now is hit subscribe, because the next story waiting for you might just be even harder to forget than this one.